What did you tell him?
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Hassan. How are you?
Assalam, Brother Mustafiz. Alhamdulillah. Doing just great.
Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair for joining. So inshallah, we may, Huma, you may begin, inshallah, bismillah, because it is 2 o'clock.
Right. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you everyone for joining today. We have a special workshop in hand. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that this Zoom session will be recorded. So it's just a reminder, this Zoom will be recorded. So today we will begin the workshop by Brother Hassan, who will make a few announcements and answer any questions, and then we will begin the workshop with Sister Javaria. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with Brother Hassan. He is the chairman of MYDT, and he's been volunteering for the Mafik Foundation for the past 4 years. He works as a patent examiner at the US Patent and Trademark Office. And prior to this, he was also a debate coach for Al-Fatih Academy for 2 years. As for our special guest today, Sister Javaria Abbasi, who will be our workshop speaker, presenter, and leader. She is a nationally ranked debate competitor and judge. She graduated from the University of Virginia in 2020, which is this year, and will be matriculating at the University of Oxford, where she will be pursuing her master's degree in Spanish literature. She has been involved in debate for 8 years. 4 years as a Tournament of the Champions level policy debater and a national octave finalist, and 4 years as the vice president of the American Parliamentary Debate Team at UVA and a nationally ranked competitor and judge. Today's focus will be on 2 main things, which is a brief recap on the basics of argumentation, as well as how to win any debate round. So now I will be handing it over to Brother Hassan, again, our chairman of MYDT.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Huma. This is a real treat. Jazakallah khair, Sister Javaria, for making time for us. I know you have a very busy schedule, so we really do appreciate it. I'm not going to take much time away from you. We're all eager to hear from you. I'm just going to mention to the folks that please get ready for August 8th is going to be our next, inshallah, virtual practice debate round. And inshallah, we're going to try to get some more concrete rules out. Jazakallah khair for those who participated last time. It really helped us kind of troubleshoot and figure out the areas we need to have more clarity on. And then, of course, please register by August 10th for the tournament, which inshallah will be on August 22nd and 23rd. And with that, I'll hand it over to Sister Javaria, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Javaria Abbasi. As Huma said, I just graduated from UVA. And today I'm going to be doing a brief workshop on the basics of argumentation. Now, before I begin, I'd like to preface this with the fact that argumentation is a little bit different from rhetoric and persuasion. Those are probably the things that you're most used to hearing about, the most used to talking about. And I'm going to ask that any questions that relate to logos, ethos, pathos, eye contact, intonation, those questions perhaps be saved for another date because they don't directly relate to the topic of my presentation, which is how do you actually win arguments? How do you construct arguments? And without further ado, if I could share my screen, if that's okay, I'm going to be doing that. Can everyone see the screen? Maybe yes, someone could just tell me yes, no.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'll be beginning then. As you can see, this is the MYDT workshop. You can also see that I've listed my email here for anyone who wants it. I want to be a resource even when I'm not in the country or anywhere that I am. If you have any questions, please email me here. I have a policy of getting back to people within 24 hours, so please let me know. Just a little bit about me. I think this has already been summarized up, but these are just the fact that I was involved with the Virginia Parliamentary Debate Society. This is me at an exhibition debate. This is me at the World's University Debating Competition 2018 in Mexico. I've traveled widely and debated in many different circuits around the world. Very exciting stuff. Now to get to a little bit about my lesson. Today, I'm going to be using this resolution because it does pertain directly to the Muslim community, and it's something that I debated at the House Judiciary Committee in Congress. And the reason that I'm picking this is because I think it's a great way to break apart the basics of argumentation by showing some parts of this resolution and how you would uphold it or debate against it. So the resolution for this lesson or this workshop is resolved: the United States federal government should not substantially increase the use of Native informants in Muslim communities as a means of decreasing terrorism. Just a little bit of preface. Historically, since the War on Terror, the Patriot Act has allowed for the United States government and the FBI to basically not only wiretap mosques, but also use members of the Muslim community as Native informants. My debate team and I were invited to Congress's Judiciary Committee to debate the validity of this and whether this was a good policy. So I'm going to be using that experience a little bit to explain the basics of argumentation. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the very first part of any debate thing. And this is basically the claim. The definition of a claim is a statement or statements that must be proven. I think this is a very important definition because oftentimes people don't realize that claims are not facts. They're not something that are tautologies that are true intrinsically in and of themselves. There's something that has to be proven through the debate. The example claim that I have provided for you is this: the use of Native informants in Muslim communities does not decrease terrorism in the United States. I've also given you another claim: the assertion that utilizing informants in Muslim communities will decrease the risk of terrorism assumes that Muslims are all terrorists in the first place and creates this stereotype or label of Muslims as criminals, terrorists, or deviants. The reason that I've provided you with two linked statements or claims rather than one is because in most debate rounds, claims have multiple parts. They're not just one sentence. Sometimes they can be 2 or 3 sentences. I think that new debaters have a tendency to think that because they're reading a paragraph, they're making more than just a claim. However, this example shows that everything in this, while articulate and making a point, is just a claim. There is nothing to support this claim yet. And this is how I get to the next part of an argument. That is the warrant. This is the reason that a statement or claim is true. As you'll notice, I've helpfully color-coded everything for you, such that when you see red, I'm talking about a claim, and when you see blue, I'm talking about a warrant. So what is an example of a warrant? The claim that I gave you in the earlier slide was about the fact that the use of Native informants does not decrease terrorism, and the fact that when, for example, you have this use of informants, it creates almost a mindset within law enforcement that labels Muslims as certain things. I then give a warrant for why the first claim is true. The first claim being that the use of informants does not decrease terrorism. It says, the majority of terrorism in the United States is not committed by Muslims, but by white males more closely fitting the description of the Oklahoma City bomber. Muslim terrorism is a low percentage of the total terrorism that takes place in the United States, most of which is political and not religious. This is a reason why the initial statement that I gave is true. The final part of the basic argument, if we were to say it has 3 parts, is the impact. This is the why the claim matters, why the fact that the claim is true is important to the judge. I think that this is the part of the debate that young debaters or new debaters struggle with the most. A lot of them can give a claim and then explain why that claim is true. but they can't always go the next step and explain why the truth of that claim matters. So for example, this example that you can see is very long. I'm not going to read through it, but basically the idea is the warrant, which was that, as you will remember, the majority of terrorism is not committed by Muslims, shows that because this is true, and because the majority of Muslims are not terrorists, the effects of this kind of surveillance and the use of informants actually creates more homegrown terrorism. It makes people feel distrusted. It makes them more susceptible to messaging. This example that I've given you is all from a policy debate round. So as you will notice, it's a little bit different from how parliamentary debate works. But overall, the message is the same in terms of how argumentation works. Now, I think that the reason I'm going to focus a little bit more on the next part of this section is that I imagine that for most debaters, claim warrant impact is natural. It's something that if you've debated for a long time, even if you don't know the exact words of it, you do it because it's something you've been taught. It's how you persuade people. I think that something that I have noticed, however, is the way that examples are used in the circuit sometimes. I think it's important to realize that examples do not replace warrants or impacts. They don't replace the reasons why something are true or the reasons why that truth matters. The way that examples should be used is that they clarify your argument to the judge. It's almost like you're painting a picture for the judge so they can see the words you said earlier more clearly. But what that means is that examples are not arguments. They are not claims, they're not warrants, and they're not impacts. They are not part of the logical structure of an argument. They're a supplement to it. There's something you should always do when you're trying to persuade a judge in addition to your argument. So for example, when I talk about the fact that my impact is how when you treat a certain population like it is lesser, you incredibly surveil it, etc., this actually leads to an increase in violent behavior. I give the example of the Black Panther movement and the IRA in the United Kingdom. These are examples that are relatively well known and can be backed up with just a few short sentences. For an example to be effective, it generally needs to be something that most people can understand. Obscure examples serve no point because, again, they're not arguments, they're not warrants, they're not impacts. So that's just my brief review, very brief, of just what the basics of argumentation is. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Let me see, how do I see the main screen?
Question.
Yeah.
So evidence would fall under the warrant, correct? So just like any, yeah, all right, just wanted to clarify that.
Oh, sorry, I was just listening to your question. I haven't answered it yet. So evidence, if I imagine that you mean just statistics or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's usually a warrant. It depends because some evidence could just be providing evidence of an example. So you do have to be careful. So let's do a quick demonstration. Say that my resolution is that United States interventions abroad worsen situations, okay? If I were to talk about specific United States interventions and provide evidence of them, even though I provided evidence, that is still just an example. However, if I were to provide evidence as to a tactic that the United States government uses in most of its interventions, that would be a warrant. So if I were to say, the United States federal government does not follow didactism, it does not actually listen to what its allies ask for, but rather goes beyond it, which is a blatant violation of international policy. Therefore, it creates mistrust within the governments who are even allied with the US and who invite the US military. That's the reason why the military presence or the intervention isn't good or worsens the situation. That's a warrant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, of course. And please, anyone ask questions. I'm happy and I'm here for that. If we're all good for now, or if you have a question even later that you think of, just stop me, flag me, let me know. I'm going to keep going then. This next part, which is the remainder of my workshop, which is the bulk of everything that I'm going to do today, is about a very famous speech. It's called the speech colloquially within most debate circuits. It's a speech given by Scott Detheridge, who is the former director of debate at Northwestern University. He was a very accomplished coach, coached for I think about 50 years, etc. I'm not going to really go into the specifics of the speech. Rather, I have distilled a few elements from his speech into tactics for how to win any debate round. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. Those tactics are just outlined here, but I will have a slide for each of them. The first is choose, the second is offense, the third is clash, the fourth is framework, the fifth is cover smart, and the sixth is narrate and judge the debate. You'll notice that I modified this a little bit from my initial outline because I realized that some of the other tactics are already covered within these umbrella terms. But if you do have any questions about anything that I listed on the original outline, let me know and I'm happy to discuss those things as well. If we're good, and without further ado, I'd like to progress. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this word choose. What does it mean to choose? Choosing and choice making is most important, I would argue, in debate for rebuttals and rebuttal speakers. And why is this? The reason is simple. Most rebuttals tend to either be shorter speeches than constructive speeches, which they are, but also rebutting a point isn't something you just do in rebuttal speeches, right? Refutation is the basis of all debate. That is what we call debate. Otherwise, constructive speeches are just speeches, right? But to understand how to give a good rebuttal, you have to also understand that a lot of information is thrown at the judge in every single debate. Constructive speeches are designed to have a lot of arguments, not all of which are as strong as the other. I think that young debaters, when giving rebuttal speeches, have a tendency to try to answer or extend every single point in the debate round. Like everything that's been said, they try to recap it and respond to it. And I think that that's not a coherent strategy, especially at initial levels. The best strategy you can learn as a rebuttal speaker is to pick one or two strong arguments and explain why those arguments are round winning. Explain why those arguments either take out everything your opponent has said or do enough mitigation such that your opponent's arguments don't matter. Why is this important? Basically, when you choose, you are telling the judge, hey, I know there was a lot of stuff that was said in this round. I know there were a lot of words from every single team, but I don't want you, judge, to have to decide what the best avenue was, because that means that the round is outside of my control. If the judge at the end of the round is autonomously deciding what the best strategy was, then you as a debater have not done your job to the fullest that you could. What you want to do in rebuttals is that you choose what the best arguments are, and then you explain why they're the best arguments to the judge. You persuade them in rebuttals why the way that you have picked, the two arguments that you thought were the most important, are truly the most important. That's choice. So that's just one of the biggest strategies I would argue in debate. Does anyone have any questions on what it means to choose?
Yes, I have a question.
Of course.
So in the rebuttal speech, like if you don't cover the other side entirely, like if, say your proposition and you don't cover all of the opposition's point, because like, you know, you're explaining your two strongest points. Do you necessarily, like, what are you necessarily supposed to do? Are you supposed to leave the opposition points or what?
So I think I'll get to this under cover smart, right? Because remember, all these strategies go together. Like keep in mind, I'm not saying only choose. Does this make sense? So this is just one thing, but I get to offense. All of these things will come together and will explain what your speech actually looks like. This is just one tactic that you are doing in a rebuttal. This is not saying don't answer anything your opponent says. Rather, it's saying of all the arguments that you have, pick your strongest arguments. So say in my constructive speech, I had 5 independent points. Do not extend 5 independent points in your rebuttal. You are not going to have time to flesh out every single one of those points and also answer all of your opponent's arguments, right? Rather, if there are arguments that are very strong, that have good warrants, good impacts, that are directly relevant to the clash that happened in the round, those are the independent points you should focus on more, especially if there's an independent point that you had that your opponents never discussed. You can extend that point, or you can say it again very briefly, but you don't need to spend 4 minutes on it, right? Because they didn't talk about it. You're already going to win that point because it was never discussed by your opponents. But there may be a point that you have that is good, but your opponents spent a lot of time on it also. So there's a lot that you have to re-articulate, re-clarify. That's what choose means. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't, you're free to also say it doesn't. Like, I do not mind. I can try in a different way. Like, I want this to be something that teaches you, if that makes sense. So let me know. I think it might make more sense, however, as we progress, because each of these tactics builds on the other, if that makes sense. So I'm going to progress for now. And then if choose is still a little iffy, we can always come back to it. The next tactic is offense, offense, offense. I think this is the part of debate that is the most complicated. It's understanding the difference between offense and defense in a debate round. For that reason, I've created a sports analogy that I hope will help people. Offensive arguments are arguments that score points for you. They're arguments that just by saying them, they could help you win the round. Usually, offensive arguments are the impacts that I talked about earlier, why not voting for you would create a negative harm, right? Those are your impacts, your reasons why your claims matter. That's offense, so your stuff. So if I'm proposition, the independent points that I made, their impacts is my offense. If I'm opposition, the same can be said. On the other hand, defensive arguments, if this was basketball, there's something that prevents the other team from scoring. It's how you refute their independent points. That's defensive, generally. There are offensive ways to refute things, but I'm not going to get into more complicated stuff. For now, we're just going to do offense, defense. I think that a mistake that young debaters often make, and of course I'm guilty of this as well when I was starting, is that you only do defense when you're refuting your opponent. What does that mean? Let's say we're having a debate round and the topic is, this house believes that cats are better than dogs. An offensive response would be all of the reasons why cats are better than dogs. If I'm proposition, that is my offense. Defense would be all the reasons dogs are not so great. Because keep in mind, even if dogs are not perfect, even if I win, the dogs are not so great, that doesn't mean cats are better than dogs. It doesn't prove my proposition. It doesn't prove my resolution. So you have to keep in mind that offense is very important. It's how you win rounds. You can't win on defense alone. That's not to say that you shouldn't have defense. It's not to say that you shouldn't say dogs aren't that great. You should. But you also have to keep in mind that at the end of the day, if I'm a judge and I see the resolution, because I do, I've written it down, and I'm writing my ballot and I notice that you didn't make any reasons why cats are actually better than dogs, but only reasons why dogs are not so great, I will probably not vote for you. And why is that true? Think of it this way. I'm comparing having a dog to having nothing. So even if dogs aren't perfect, even if they sometimes make messes, even if they do all of these things, even if I grant you all of your defense, your opponent still has offense. They still have some reasons why it's better than nothing. So you don't ever want the round to get to that point. Have offense. When you're a more advanced debater, you are able to anticipate your opponent's warrants and credibility before they make it. So let's say I have a debate round and I am proposition. I can often do this. I can give my speech and make my points, but as I'm writing them, I should also think about the weaknesses of my own points. What is going to be the response to the points that I wrote? Anticipating that and then putting it within my constructive speech is how you have a very strong offensive argument. But that's a very advanced technique. That's something that you do, I'd say, much later within your debate career. If you're just starting, this is something that's really new for you, focus on just scoring points. Make independent points. Does anyone have any questions about offense and or defense, either one?
Actually, I have a question. Is there any room for defensive points once you've made your offensive?
So you never want to do defense to your own points. In most types of debate, that's called a double turn, which means that you're negating yourself and you will lose the round. So if I have an impact, I don't want to ever on any other argument make something that could also take out my own offense. So say, let's give an example. Cats are better than dogs, and I'm proposition. Opposition gets up and says that cats are very unsociable and they have a tendency to scratch people. And one of my points was about how cats are very sociable, okay? I cannot say on their point, oh, you're right. Cats can sometimes be unsociable, but because that's actually defense to also my own independent point. In that instance, I have to be careful because their point was a direct refutation of my original point. So how I defend against it has to be different. Otherwise, you're doing offense and defense on different types of arguments. You're doing defense against their arguments. Your arguments are your offense. Remember to balance both. I think that most new debaters are actually pretty good at defense because it's the intuitive thing. Your opponent said something, you got to say something back. But remembering their own arguments becomes difficult. Does that make sense? Is that good for everyone?
Yes, thank you so much.
Oh, of course, yeah, my pleasure. So I'm gonna keep going on.
So,
yeah, sorry, did someone say something?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
for the negative harm,
Okay.
so you say in the first bullet point, you say essentially to score a point, you should give a reason why not voting, why the judge, if they vote for the other team, that would voting for the opposition or you know what I mean. If they vote for the other team, that would result in a negative harm.
Mm-hmm.
So could you have an offensive point instead, where it's just by saying that, do you think giving a negative harm for voting for the other team is intrinsically better than giving a benefit for voting for your team?
I see what you're saying. So they're the same thing. The not voting for your team results in negative harm. That is the reason, that is the benefit for voting for your team. That is the impact. That's the why the truth matters. The reason it's phrased as a negative harm is that in some rounds, for example, if your round is about a policy or a war or anything like that, there are clear negative harms. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But in some rounds, that's not the case. It's just a reason why you should vote for our team. So it's phrased that way to encompass both types of resolutions, but they're the same. Offense encompasses both. They're both offense. They're different kinds of offense. One is more impact oriented, right? And sometimes offense can be more warrant oriented. It depends. But the point is, you always want to have offense.
No, yeah, I was just making sure that I was just wondering if you thought a specifically negative harm was, you heard I think you understood what my question was, but yeah.
You were asking me what type of impact I think is more persuasive, whether it's a negative harm or whether it's just a reason the truth matters. And what I was explaining is, both impacts matter. Neither is better than the other. It just depends on the type of round. On the resolution, cats are better than dogs. I mean, there's not really a negative harm for voting for dogs, right? But if the resolution was about a war, whether or not we should invade X country or whether or not X policy is just or unjust, there are negative consequences. In which case, that's what your impact would be. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Well, yeah, of course.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
So you say that, you can't win on defense alone, right? What about the opposition? Can't the opposition team sometimes win if they have just like on defense alone or no?
So
Like
technically,
down every argument of the proposition, and they haven't had good, how do I say, comebacks by the proposition.
this is a good point. I probably should have mentioned this, but for opposition, negating the resolution is offense. So what is considered offense and defense flips if you're opposition.
Makes sense.
Like when you are, what it sounds like you're saying is like that technically what would be considered defense if you were proposition is offensive if you're opposition, because the opposition's only job is to negate the resolution, right? Opposition does not have to offer a counter plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
But that's technically offensive if you're opposition. But I think offense, mostly this is something that applies to proposition teams. The reason why an opposition team should know this is because they should know, because say your opponent doesn't extend their offense, it's not on the judge to catch that. It's on you as the opposition to state it, right?
Right.
So if I'm opposition, okay, I'm giving the rebuttal, and I realize that the proposition completely forgot about their own points, I get up and say, hey, judge, we've given you reasonable, like maybe 10 reasons why these individual points don't stand. Proposition has not gone back and given you additional warrants or additional reasons that surpass our reasons. The burden of proof or the burden to affirm is on them. If there is doubt to whether any of these things stand, that is reason to vote opposition. Does that make sense? But that's offensive because that's an independent reason why you could win the round. But when you're proposition, that is not offensive.
Totally makes sense. Yeah, what you're saying, what you said right in the beginning was that for the defense, for the opposition, the defense itself is the offense, right?
Yes, it's offensive because the roles are switched.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Everyone good? Can I proceed? Okay, I'm going to keep going. This is probably one of the most important points, and this is clash. This is the fundamental building block of any winning strategy. And the reason I say this is really important is because if you've ever judged a debate round, you can say this very easily. A debate round where there are two ships passing in the night is so boring. It is the most horrible, excruciating thing to judge, but it's also not that educational for the people involved, right? Because basically it's a bunch of teams and a bunch of debaters giving speeches, but then at the end, the judge has to sit down and decide magically how all of these things interact. That also makes the judge's job super hard and very biased because they have to make their own executive decision on what sounds more persuasive, what was better, because no one did the work for them. And those are often the rounds that teams leave feeling the most frustrated. You probably didn't realize it, but that's what you were missing in that round, clash. So this is a critical question in any round. How does the judge decide between two alternatives? How do they decide between points on which you both have said something? Does that make sense? Rounds where there's actually ink on the page for both sides. This is a very difficult part of judging because while it may seem black or white to debaters, it's often very gray. So what we're talking about here is called argument resolution. How does the judge decide when both teams have said something on X point, which team was better? This is about the nexus question. I define the nexus question, and most coaches do, as the tipping point of the debate. This is the crucial issue where if the judge had to say at the end of the round, there was one thing that made them vote proposition or made them vote opposition, that's where it was. Sometimes to new debaters, this nexus question seems magical. You hear the judge's reason for decision and you're like, how on earth did they get there? Like, how did they decide this random third point was the most important one when I spent 4 minutes on the first point? Usually it's because the judge can see how the logic of points interact in a way that new debaters cannot. Oftentimes, this is for more experienced judges, of course, they can see that while you spent a lot of time on the first point, that point wasn't that important to negating or to proving the resolution. But the point you only talked about for a minute, that was the nexus question. And whoever talked about it better is the one they ultimately voted for. The trick then becomes, as a debater, how do you learn what the nexus question is? How do you anticipate, right, what the judge is going to magically decide is important at the end? It's easy. You don't leave the magic to the judge. If there's a round where the judge has to magically decide what was the most important argument, that means that it's a round where there wasn't good clash. You didn't explain why the points that you said are superior to the points your opponent said in addressing the resolution. So let's give an example to make this a little bit less theoretical. Let's go back to the example I said about military interventions. So United States federal government military interventions abroad worsen the situation. Conceivably, a point of class will be the question of worsening the situation, right? So conceivably, the opposition team will come up with a lot of reasons why certain US strategies actually make situations in war zones better. And you will say, no, those same strategies, as proposition, you will say, no, those same strategies actually make the situation worse. Now, I'm a judge sitting here. One side is saying the strategy makes it worse. One side is saying it makes it better. How on earth do I decide who's correct? That's a very gray area. There's a lot of clash there. The way that a good judge and the way that most rounds will be decided in that case is who better explains what it means to worsen a situation. For example, perhaps opposition talked a lot about how military interventions improve the economy. Let's just give that as an example, okay? I don't think this is actually true, but we're just gonna say that's what they said. US military interventions improve the economies of places they're invading. And proposition says, well, we don't think that the improvement to the economy is substantial enough to outweigh the loss of life. That would be a direct clash, and that would be proposition explaining why their arguments about the loss of life or human rights outweigh their opponent's arguments. They're better addressing what they think means to worsen a situation. That's them answering the nexus question and framing their argument that has had some clash on it in a way that's beneficial to them. That way, when the round ends and I'm the judge sitting here with these 2 points, like, oh, how do I decide? I realize, oh wait, one team told me that even if it's true, even if opposition's point is true, that the economy improves, that doesn't matter as much as they think. Wow, this makes my job so much easier. Okay, so that's clash. Does anyone have questions about clash? I think this is the most complicated part of debate, so I would love to have questions.
So does the proposition have the advantage in defining the nexus question and like their framing?
That's more framework, which we will get to in the next turn.
Oh, gotcha.
I definitely think that the proposition has an advantage on framework because they have the first mover advantage, which is true of any kind of debate, whether it's a team sport, right? But I definitely don't think they have an advantage in clash. The nexus question isn't always a framework question. In this instance, the example I gave you, it wasn't a framework question, it was an impact weighing question, right? Yeah. It was, yes, your impact happens, but I'm going to mitigate the magnitude of that impact. It doesn't matter that much because the economy's increase is maybe what? Let's say it's 4%, but the loss of life is 50% of your population dies, right? Yeah. That's a magnitude plus probability and all those other thing question. So it's a weighing question. So but you're right. Sometimes clash can happen on framework.
So I guess what I'm asking is, because a lot of the time you don't have the benefit of getting to weigh economy versus you don't have the benefit of being able to weigh economy versus human life or like human rights. And so well, more specifically, what I'm asking is, what happens when whoever you're facing essentially tells the judge, states, this is like the nexus question, like not necessarily says this is the nexus question, but the reason why we win is because, etc. And essentially, so what happens, like, how would you address that if whoever you're facing decides to like say something different is the nexus question than from whatever you were saying is like the nexus question?
In a good debate where there's clash, that will always happen. You should almost never agree on what the nexus question is, because you want to frame it as whatever's better for your side, right? Like if I'm losing a point, I'm not going to say that's the nexus question.
Yeah.
You want to frame whatever is best for your side as the most important issue in the debate round, because you want to show how every other point in the round relates to the point that you're choosing. The team that better shows that will usually win that their argument is the nexus question. Gotcha. So if I show why the economy cannot function without human lives, I have proven why my point subsumes their point. Conversely, if I show that more human lives are lost by a failed economy, I've subsumed their nexus question. So this clash on the nexus question on what's the most important thing in the debate is very important. And both sides will, yeah, I agree with you. They're not going to agree.
Yeah.
There are times when they will. Like there are times where both of you might agree that human life matters, but you might say that your policy does it better, right? That's a debate in which you both agree on the nexus question, and it just comes down to who has better warrants and who has better impacts. But many rounds, that will not be the case.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Of course.
Can I ask something?
Of course, please.
So we have a lot of middle school and high school debaters here. And what we generally tend to see is that, you know, one side will come up and make their affirmative arguments, and then the people opposing them will summarize the arguments and then knock them down one by one. And that's kind of where we see the clash in the refutation. And then they just go back and forth, summarizing the other side and then summarizing their points, and then just trying to pick away each point the other side has made, either in their constructive speeches or in the points of information that they make. So it's kind of like a pinging back and forth. But I think what you're talking about here is elevating that in a more nuanced way and say, look, you know, just don't attack the other side's point, but really grab the round and make it yours, right? You wanna frame their arguments in your own favor, and then distill their points in a way that favors you, and then kind of do the jujitsu on them, where you're like taking the essence of their argument and saying, okay, after you do your refutations, even if they are right, this is why our side position is more, why our side's position can overcome their most important point of the round, for example.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think what young debaters don't realize is the debate isn't about who's more true or who's more right. You can be completely right on every point you said, but it has nothing to do with the round. Unfortunately, that means you're missing clash. There are many rounds where both sides will make good fact claims, but they will miss the why it matters, the impacting, because they're not getting to the nexus question, right? And so basically what I'm talking about is, you're right, do that ping pong, do what they call line by line, right? But also explain to the judge as you're doing it, like, hey, star this argument, right? Like that's sometimes how I used to say in debate round. Like star this argument that I just made, because I think it's the most important question. Because if we were to go down to every one of my opponent's responses, it's based on X presumption. But actually, we've already negated that presumption from our first speech, right? That's being ahead of them. That's anticipating them. So it's going back to offense, right? I'm combining offense with anticipating what they're going to say, and also clash. I'm directly, like, I'm not saying this argument at the top before I've gotten to what they're saying. That would be just offensive framing. If I just said what I was going to say at the top, before I said anything else, that's offense. But if I take that offense and actually say it exactly like when I'm going down the line by line where they said their point, that's clash plus offense. Because the judge doesn't have to magically connect the dots between the thing I first said and what I'm saying now. I'm connecting the dots for them. They can directly see that line, and suddenly the round isn't a magical win for one side. Again, it's clear where the decision came from. It's in my hands. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay.
It does to me. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you for asking the questions. I appreciate it. So let's keep going. The next one, which I think Omar was asking me about actually a lot, and I think this is what you were getting at a little bit, is, framework. So I think one of my favorite quotes from Scott Deathridge's speech that I've liberally used to frame this is this quote: "Debate is a game of words. The outcome of a debate is determined on the basis of a few words, not many." Here's how I explain this. Think of a soccer game. Anyone who's watched soccer outside of like the Brazil-Germany debacle will know that there's not usually a lot of scoring in soccer. There's maybe 90 minutes and 1 or 2 goals. And yet those 1 or 2 goals are mostly what people remember. Those are oftentimes, when distilled, the only things that mattered. You could have played well for 85 minutes, but if you get scored on the 86th minute, you lose, right? And I think that that is what framework is. Framework are those goals. They're the 1 to 2 shots, the few words that establish what the rules of the engagement are, what the rules of the debate round are. These are the definitions of words in a resolution, oftentimes. And something that you will see in high-level debates is that, unlike early debates where the proposition just comes up and defines the resolution and the opposition just lays over and takes it, later in more advanced debates in your career, there will actually be contestation on what a resolution means. For example, if we go back to, this house believes that cats are better than dogs. Framework would be a definition of how the judge should evaluate what it means to be better than. Cats are better pets than dogs. Cats are better cuddlers than dogs. Cats are whatever more than dogs. That would be, or it could be the other way, right? Dogs are better pets, dogs are better cuddlers, etc. That's the framework. What's important to understand, however, is that winning framework does not mean that you automatically win the round. There are rounds in which that may be the case, but that's only because you are already winning under your framework. I think the biggest mistake that new debaters make is that they write a speech in which they spend 4 minutes of their constructed talking about the framework, about why it's about, the resolution is about who's a better pet. And then they forget to explain why cats are actually better pets. Yes, you proved that the metric is pets, but you didn't actually prove the resolution. You didn't actually prove that cats are the better pet. So if you win that pets is the resolution, but under that resolution, your opponent wins that dogs are better pets, you still lose the round, even if you won the framework. So you do have to keep in mind that framework just makes your life easier. You can offensively frame things to exclude your opponent's arguments, but you still have to win under your framework. You still have to affirm or negate the resolution. Does that make sense? Any questions? If not, I'm going to proceed. Okay. I think this goes back to the first question that I was asked on choose. Like, should I just choose and ignore everything my opponent says? No, right? Choosing is just part of this grand strategy that is called covering smart. This also goes back to what Brother Hassan was talking about with the ping pong game, right? The thing that judges hate the most, which is if a debate round just devolves into yes, Y point, no Y point, yes, X point, no X point. That's not persuasive. And even though you're answering everything, you're not actually debating. You're just talking, and that's not debate, right? So this is probably the most difficult part of debate, which is why I spent the most time on it. Cover smart.
Javaria?
Yeah.
Before you get into that, we do have one question.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I didn't see it.
Nura Ahmed is asking, I'm a little confused as to what a nexus question is. It's probably important to clarify that before we move on.
Okay, so nexus is just another word for central, if that helps. A nexus question is just typically the most contested point in a round. Sadly, there's no perfect strategy to tell you how to identify it. You could read the same case against different teams and the nexus question would be different depending on how the team refuted that case. The best way, I think, though, to identify a nexus question in a debate round, I will get to when I get to the last point, which is how to narrate and judge the debate. So if it's okay that I hold on until then, that would be great. If not, I can just distill it down to this. I'll give you an example and then I'll explain that example. So if I was debating cats are better than dogs, okay, like the resolution I keep using, I think that framework is one of the nexus questions in that debate round. Framework is one of the most important things, is explaining what it means to be better than. Because if I'm defending dogs, I'll probably argue that the framework is for which animal is more sociable. That's how you decide which is better, because that's really good offense for me because dogs are much more sociable animals by nature than cats, right? But if I'm proposition, I might say it's the animal that is the most self-sufficient because cats are more self-sufficient than dogs. In that specific instance, your framework is the same as your nexus question. But in other rounds, for example, if I were to talk about policy, right? If I were to go back to the example of the military intervention, and one side were to argue about how the nexus question is about human life, and the other one argues that the nexus question, even if it is about human life, even if we both agree that human life is the most important thing when we're deciding on war policy, say that both teams agree that that is the most important nexus question, you might disagree in your clash. You might disagree on how you get to that question. One side might say, we should avoid interventions that are likely to cause enmity within a population because of maybe racial tensions, gender tensions, historic tensions, and such avoid that because that leads to collateral damage. That leads to massacres that are not warranted. That leads to unsanctioned violence. Perhaps proposition makes that argument. But then opposition might argue, no, we think the best way to protect human life is to have military presences that stimulate the war economy of certain regions because these places are incredibly poor and their people are dying and starving and having a civil war anyways. So having US military presence there, which at least offers jobs on bases, et cetera, is actually better for people providing for their families and human life. In that instance, the nexus question, human life, was the same. So it's basically just, what is the central point? What do I have to most convince the judge about?
And if I could just make a comment, the nexus question will be determined by the flow of dialogue going back and forth, right? You can't just, you can't just say, okay, X is the nexus question. The nexus question is a question in the mind of the judge as they are,
yes,
as they're processing what's coming out of both sides, right? And then for them, the nexus question is going to be the question that both sides, after listening to both sides, arguments and refutations, that question is going to be the question that they have to decide for themselves. Am I?
Yes.
Okay.
And something that I will say is that really good debaters, like I did APTA, American Parliamentary Debate, which is completely extemporaneous for 4 years. I got very used to certain types of motions. So if I was debating a military motion, there are certain things that I could always anticipate being important to the round, even before the round began. So in my constructed speech, I would say that that was the nexus question if I was proposition or if I was opposition in the constructed, even before the rebuttals, because I can anticipate the opponent's offense. I can anticipate their defense because that's experience, right? Because what you will learn is that even though the words change of resolutions, resolutions have patterns. Resolutions about certain subject matter have patterns, and you can see that coming. But I definitely agree that if you cannot predict it, do not try to force it. It's much safer if you actually don't know what the most important question is yet, to do it in your rebuttal based on how the debate is gone, and to only worry about doing it in constructives if you know it. Because like Brother Hassan was saying, it comes down to the clash. The clash in the round determines the nexus question, and you want to, once it has been determined, make sure that the remainder of the clash that you have is framed around it, right? Because there will always be clash before the nexus question is determined in constructives, right? For example, if I'm doing the opposition constructive, the first constructive, I'm going to refute the first proposition constructive. That's technically clash, but there may not be a nexus question yet. But by the rebuttals, there should be. If the round is close or a good round, there will be. So now to move forward. The next thing and the most important, difficult thing that any debater learns is covering smart. You will always face opponents who are smarter than you, who are more word efficient than you, who can come up with 10 arguments to your every one argument. It happens. There will always be skill disparities. So how do you win those rounds? How do you win rounds when people are just that much better at generating arguments than you? So we're going to get the example of if someone reads 10, if I'm proposition and opposition comes up with 10 refutations to each of my independent points. This is an extreme example that probably would not happen, but it's just a bit more clear for illustration purposes. How do I win if I'm proposition in this scenario? Couple of things. This is going to combine everything we've talked about so far. The first is use your framework to exclude irrelevant arguments. The likelihood is that if opposition had time to make 10 arguments for every argument that you made, they have made a lot of throwaway arguments. Arguments that are not even actually arguments, they're just claims. There's no warrant, there's no impact. Or some of them might be good arguments, but they're not relevant to the framework that you have already proposed. If you can, right off the bat, remind the judge about your framework and explain why those arguments don't meet your framework and are therefore irrelevant. Don't just say it's irrelevant because my framework. Remember, you have to be winning your framework for this to work. But if you are winning your framework or if your framework is uncontested, this is the easy way to exclude some others. The next thing is, this is the hardest part, I think, is grouping similar arguments. I think this is where young debaters play the ping pong game and lose rounds and struggle a lot. My opponent made 10 arguments. I'm going to go to the page and answer all 10 arguments, and then I'm going to run out of time to make my own arguments because there's no possible way, no matter how good you are, that you could answer all 10 arguments, right? But maybe 5 of the 10 arguments are actually based on the same premise. Most likely, they are. That's called a link. They have the same link. So for example, if I were to say cats are better than dogs because cats, like you don't have to scoop up after them. They can just visit a litter, okay? And then I make a bunch of points of why cats are clean animals. My opponent could probably just group all of those points and answer why cats are clean animals. They don't really need to go to the litter specific argument because that's a waste of time, right? It comes down to the same thing. Instead, you would just group all of those different arguments and then explain why, even if cats are clean animals, either that's not a metric because it's not your framework, right? So you can take it out their framework if it's not relevant, or you could say all of these points are on the same thing. I'm just going to refute why cats being clean animals isn't true. That would be grouping a similar argument. So you can use either strategy to debate that argument. The final thing, this is what you do if you just cannot answer every argument. Because no matter what any coach tells you, they will tell you answer everything. But at the end of the day, there will be rounds you just can't. It's happened to me, it happens to everyone. You can still win those rounds very easily. And that's by prioritizing the arguments that matter to the nexus question. clash. And here we're going to combine everything I talked about before. If everyone remembers choose, in choose I told you that you should pick one or two of your arguments, right? In clash I told you that you should make your offense, the things you chose, hopefully they were offense, please don't choose defense. I explained why that's not a great reason to go for in your rebuttal. The offense you chose, you now need to explain why that's the nexus question. That's clash. Now, undercover smart, your opponent has made defense to your arguments that are your nexus question. Prioritize answering those. Any argument that's not related to the two arguments you're going to choose, not related to your direct offense that you're going to extend, not related to your nexus question, explain, literally just say, this is not relevant, here's why, and move on. Don't think of a response to it. Don't waste your time trying to, it's too much, right? You're still answering it. Saying that an argument is not relevant or just extending your offense and explaining why your offense subsumes it, it's still a response. It's just not a response that takes a lot of time. It's going to take up your speech time. That's what it means to cover smart. It's efficiency. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to everyone?
It does. So a question came in about,
Yeah.
Could you please clarify choose? And that's like the
Yes.
building block that everything is based on. So if my understanding of choose is that you have a lot of things you can talk about basically, right? You got to pick wisely and go for the high impact things.
Mm-hmm.
And you only have 3 minutes, 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You can't possibly go through everything. And that kind of goes to your grouping similar arguments, although it's a different vantage point, but basically pick the high impact stuff. Am I right about that?
Yes.
If you could just kind of summarize what you said about choose.
Yeah, why don't I give an example? Because I don't think I gave a great example for choose. So why don't I do that? I think that might clarify. So in a debate round, I think this is I think the team for which this matters the most is proposition. When you have to answer the block or when negative has back-to-back speeches, and they're going to make so many arguments that I was a rebuttal speaker in that position for 8 years. You can't answer it all. It is impossible. And if you do try to answer it all, you'll just lose because you'll forget about your own offense, right? That's when this matters. You need to choose your strongest point. So you remember how your constructive had 3 independent points probably? That's how you've taught it. Pick your strongest point and use that to beat all of your opponent's points. That one point can be used to meet your own framework. It can be used to answer similar arguments, and it can be used to show why it better answers the nexus question. That one point is the point you have to defend like your life depends on it. That's the point where if your opponent has answered it in any shape or form, prioritize answering those answers. That's the choice you made. Obviously, it's hard to choose. The first few times you do it, you might choose the wrong argument and lose the round. And the judge will tell you, I don't know why you chose that argument. It doesn't matter. Don't stop choosing. You will choose wrong until you learn to narrate and judge the debate. And that's the last step I'll get to. But always choose. It's better to lose because you chose wrong than to lose because you went for so many things that they could never have voted for you in the first place. Does that make sense?
I think that really helps. Thank you so much.
Of course. And thank you for the questions.
Some questions. I have a few actually. So my first one is that if you're in the rebuttal speech, should you tell the judges that like because of like our second point, since if it was the nexus like question, then should you say should you say because of our nexus point we win the debate, or is that like, because is it bad to say like we win this debate, or is that like bad, rude, or something?
I think the only bad part of that is claiming what your nexus question is. Like, I think to clarify, you're going to say what the most important argument is. You don't want to use jargon like nexus question, which is quite particular to certain college circuits and will not be understood by most of your judges. But yes, if you were to say, we have proved why this is the most important point, and every other point that both teams have said come back to this area, therefore we win, that's fine. That's a fine way to wrap up. I do think, though, that rather than the claim part of it, the claim is the least important, right? That claim is nice just to clear, it's called signposting, right? You're just clarifying to your judge why you said this. You should always do that. But that's more of a rhetorical strategy, not an argumentative strategy. That's just for clarity to your judge why you're even bothering explaining something. Rather show the judge with your warrants and impacts why something is the most important point and why you've won it.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. And also, in a rebuttal speech, should you say your arguments first and then like the refutations, or the other side's first?
In a rebuttal speech, you said?
Yeah, like the third.
Okay, so this is going to go back to offense, offense, offense. Never save your offense for after your defense. You will forget, you will run out of time. Don't do it. Always start with your offense. So start with your point in the rebuttal, the point that you're winning the best, the strongest point you have, the one that really relates to the nexus question, and then use that point, once you've explained why it's the most important point again, to beat all the other defense, to beat all the other arguments. Because if you do it the other way and you just start refuting arguments, what if you run out of time to explain why the thing that you used to do all those refutations was the most important point? That could be game over, right? Like you have 3 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever. Say that I went through the entire flow and I used one argument to beat all of their arguments, but then I run out of time to explain why that one argument matters. That would be bad. So does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and sorry, one more.
Don't apologize, it's fine.
Can you categorize the other side's points? Like pretend they had like 6 or something, and some of them were like sub points kind of. Can you like categorize them and then kind of like make up your own points of theirs, kind of, but it's still like relevant. Not make up your own, but just categorize, basically categorize like 2 points or something, and then like refute that.
I think this will get to narrate and judge the last part, but I think there's 2 responses to that. The first is, if by categorize you mean grouping, yes, certainly. You should group arguments. Like your opponents are not going to group them for you. Like they're not going to say, hey everyone, these 2 points I have the exact same premise, so you can just group them and then refute them both at the same time. No one's going to say that. That's an assertion that you're making. So of course you have to prove it, right? Do that. Okay. But categorize, you have to be careful not to pigeonhole your opponent's arguments. Because if you say that an argument means something that it doesn't mean, and you answer the thing that you categorized it as, that could be seen as something that's not actually a refutation.
Yeah.
Like if you answer the wrong argument, that's not defense, right? So do be careful.
Yeah, I meant grouping, I think. Not
Yes, definitely do that. That's part of covering SMART. It's a very important part of it, actually.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Sister Javaria, we're at 1 hour. Do you need a break or anything? Or we just wanted to make sure you're okay.
I'm okay, but if anyone else wants to take a break, we can do that. I'm fine with you.
I think people can get up and go as they please. And alhamdulillah, we're recording this as well. So
I'm totally good to just power through while it's in my head, because like all the arguments are still in my head right now. And then if that's okay with everyone.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay. So we're also on the penultimate slide too. So we might have one more after this. So cover SMART part 2. I'm just going to read this straight through because this is probably one of my favorite quotes from the Deatherage speech. And it relates to covering SMART. If you happen to be one of those random kids who has the capacity to cover every single argument in a debate without really much challenge, then I would go ahead and encourage you to take advantage of that skill. It is just not very common. Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, said, "Perseverance is how most things get done. Form cannot substitute for substance. All the numbers and taglines in the world won't make up for a lack of meaning." Now, I would love it if someone in the audience could explain maybe what the last bolded part of this quote means in relation to everything we've covered so far. And take a guess. You can be wrong. Doesn't matter. Any guess is better before I explain. I would especially love it if one of our debaters could try.
Let's get one of the high school kids.
Yeah.
Anybody? Anyone, any other high school kids want to take a crack at it?
Can you please repeat the question?
Yeah. So you can all see my screen still, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The bolded part says, Form cannot substitute for substance. All the numbers and the taglines in the world won't make up for a lack of meaning. I was wondering if you could explain what this means in relationship to argumentation, any of the things we've covered, whether it's choosing, offense, covering smart, clash, framework. And there's no wrong answer. Like if you relate it to anything and it's a correct relation, it's correct, right? This is all interpretation.
I can take a try at it.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well, whoever just spoke.
I can try.
Yeah, please do.
So I think it's saying, like, even if you have structure and even if you know what you're talking about, if you don't explain it properly, and if you don't explain it properly, it kind of doesn't really have a meaning and it doesn't really help.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely a part of it. I think that definitely gets to the form cannot substitute for substance and make up for a lack of meaning. But what about all the numbers and the taglines in the world? What's the second part of that?
So I'll take a jab at that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what that's talking about is like, it doesn't matter how many statistics you throw. Ties in back into what was just said. Like if you don't show a legitimate series of logic, if you don't show that path from the resolution to the judge voting for you, then it doesn't matter how many how many short ways how many ways you can remind the judge of the points that you made if they don't have legitimate reasoning behind them that actually convinces the judge. Because it can sound good, it can sound great, but if it doesn't actually make sense at the end of the day, doesn't matter how many times you re-emphasize whatever you have to say, or how many numbers that you just threw in randomly. Won't cut it.
Definitely. So let's combine both of those things and now relate them to cover smart. Like, why does Detheridge put this quote under cover smart, right? It seems like it relates to other things too, because these all come together. Basically, in addition to what Nura and Omar said, form, which is, yes, structure, but also just how many arguments you're making, like the substance, the numbers, the taglines, right? So let's just throw that all together. So not starting at substance, form, numbers, and taglines. Numbers often doesn't just mean statistics, it also means the number of arguments you are making, right? Like 10, you put 10 refutations to something. Tagline is a slang for claim, right? It's the number of claims you're making, the number of things you're just throwing out there in a ping pong game, right? That, and even if it's structured properly, like as my refutation to X person's point on this thing, on this thing, on this thing, down the line, that's all proper form. That doesn't make up for substance, right? That doesn't make up for quality. That doesn't make up for choosing, right? For picking that one argument and making it super good. But also, the other thing that's important is that if you look at the first part of the quote, right? Most kids, most people cannot answer every argument, right? So rather than prioritize a style of debate in which the only thing you do is answer arguments, remember in your head, Detheridge is saying, that substance can still beat that. Your opponent can have 10 arguments to every one, but if that one argument you have is so well warranted, has so many impacts, or has such good or you have such good framework that you can outframe the rest of their stuff, you will still win. And the story that I didn't write here, but I'll quickly extrapolate, is that Detheridge talked about two teams that he had observed for years. One team was, I think, Emory, and the other team was, I want to say Harvard and Emory, okay? One debate person on each of the teams had been high school partners, but they now debated, one for Harvard and one for Emory. The team from Harvard was so much faster and had so many more arguments than the team from Emory. Like, they were just known as being the technically best team. Their structure was impeccable. They just said a lot of words. And they were very good. I mean, it was Harvard, right? They were amazing. But for some reason, they could never beat this debater from Emory, who in policy debate, if you know anything about it, it's a very fast activity. This guy was super slow, like notoriously slow. He made one argument for everyone else's 15, but he always won. And you know why? Because he was super smart about his framing. He understood substance. He would use one argument to just win every other argument in the round. That's what I think is good debating. That's the best kind of debating. Does that make sense? Cool. I'm going to keep going to the last slide.
I have a question.
Yeah. Yes.
So you keep saying like if like you pick one of your points and make it really strong and like yeah, but what if you don't have one really strong point? What if they're all kind of like not half, but like medium? They're all like okay points, not really good.
Well, I imagine in constructives that all three of your points will be pretty mediocre, right? Like you're probably just trying to get them out there. That's exactly what I mean though. The debater who speaks after the first constructive should pick the arguments they think that they can add the most to, that they can use to win the clearest, and flesh them out. Give more examples, add more warrants, explain more reasons why that point is true, right? That's choosing. Does that make sense? So like, okay, say that there's a resolution and my first speaker does not give a good first speech. Like their constructive points suck. Maybe they have 3 points, but they don't make much sense. They're not warranted and there's no impacts. Well, I can't just be like, haha, forget all of those. I'll come up with 3 new independent points in my next speech. No, because then the opponent could just refute those as well and they're never flushed out again, right? Instead, look at the 3 points. Do any of them have potential? Is there anything that you can use from those claims to add warrants and to add impacts? If you can, do it, right? That's what your job is as a proposition. On the other hand, as the opposition, if you notice that your opponent doesn't do that, this is where you do anticipation. You anticipate how they're going to have to add warrants later, add links, add impacts, and you refute them before they even happen. So,
okay, yeah. Thank you.
That makes sense? Yeah, of course.
So,
and, yeah.
I don't, this isn't exactly tied into this directly,
totally
but it ties into something that you just said. So if, let's say your first speaker, because I've had this happen to me before, like so the first speaker essentially, they didn't understand an argument as well as they should have. And so they left a weak link and the other team just kept hammering in on that, like on that weak link in that argument.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is like the best approach at, like when you know that the other team has found is like sharks and they found their prey, like they found the weak point. What do you do at that point? Like, should you just like, I don't know if that's like specific enough for you to address, but like
No, it is. I can give you a good example. So when I was in the finals of the NYU debate tournament, or semifinals, me and my partner were against the best team on finance, Yale. They were the national champions from the year before. And they were debating a case that said, this house should ban short selling disclosure, okay? Neither my partner or I were finance majors. We know nothing about finance, like actually, no, okay? Very difficult round for us. And my partner made a point about margin accounts that wasn't incorrect, but it was so simplified that it sounded incorrect. Like when it was articulated, it was not articulated the way it was written on the paper that we had communicated to each other. And so Yale just destroyed this point, like hammered it, showed how it didn't make sense. Like this is not how margin accounts work. It actually was, but he just misspoke, right? So my job was first to clarify, right? Like this was just this is what the argument was. But even if you don't buy that, here's why this clarification I've made is a better argument anyway. But there are times when that can't happen. Like there might be a time where your partner just makes an argument that's so bad, you can't salvage it. In that case, don't choose that argument. Like you hopefully have 3, choose something else. Like if you cannot defend the link or you cannot defend the point, don't waste your time. Like,
so you just like say, this isn't like, this doesn't really matter. Like you essentially try to make an argument for why that's not important to
Well, if they just
But
did defense,
as important.
if they just made defense, then that's not going to win them around if you have other offense,
True.
right?
Okay.
So you just
Yeah.
say, like, I would never concede a point that early in the round because that's unstrategic, because then they don't have to waste their time on it anymore. You want them to waste their time. You want them to think that you care about that point. I would just put something on there, some response that takes you 2 seconds to think of, so they have to waste their time thinking you might go for it, and then you actually spend your time somewhere else.
Got it.
That's the
All
trick.
right.
But later on, yeah, in a rebuttal, I would not even bother. You're not going to win that point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to, like you said, covering smarts. It's actually very relevant.
And it shows the importance of choosing wisely as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Back to your
Definitely.
first point.
Okay.
I think the thing is, like, if, like, when you see that happen, like, I think a huge thing for debaters is you get emotionally attached to some of your points, and like
Really?
I've done that too. And the thing is, you have to make sure that you aren't emotionally attached to your points, and that you're able to be logical about it, essentially.
Omar,
not
you're
sentimental.
perfect. You just perfectly segued into my last point. I really appreciate that comment, because you know what? That's literally the most important thing of debating. Narrating and judging the debate. This is how you write the ballot for your judge. And the most important thing that anyone will ever tell you, and I guarantee that this will increase your win-loss ratio, your win ratio substantially. It's understanding the strengths of your opponent's arguments and not just their weaknesses. I think that novice debaters, new debaters generally, have a really bad habit of pigeonholing their opponent's arguments. What does that mean? They look at the worst version of their opponent's argument and they answer that. They answer maybe the warrant that was the weak warrant, even though there was a stronger one. Or they make fun of the argument because it came out sounding not as persuasive as it might be, just because the speaker was nervous, but the point is still there. They don't give their opponents credit. That is bad debating, right? That's very common in new debaters, but you're a new debater. But once you become a better debater, you realize there is no round that you have automatically won. There is no such thing as an automatic win. No matter how much your opponent messes up in their constructives, no matter how bad those constructive sounds, if you have a good enough rebuttal debater, they can still beat you. You have to be careful. And this is what it comes down to. The question that I always ask myself, and this is what every good debater asks themselves before they give a rebuttal speech. When you're hearing your opponent wrap up their speech, you should be thinking this in the last minute to yourself. Look at your flow, look at your papers. If we are to lose this debate, why? Where would I lose this round? The judge is going to look at this round at the end, and they're going to write a ballot, or they're going to give an oral reason for decision. Where will their reasoning begin? Your rebuttal should then be framed around answering that question. The reason why I want to say the nexus question to this explanation is because this is the most cogent way, or the most coherent way, the most relevant way to find the nexus question. Most rounds in your rebuttal, the nexus question will be this question. It's what your opponent has selected as their nexus. If you were to lose the round, where would it be? That's how your rebuttal should be functioned around mitigating. So yes, you have your own offense, your own story. But if I had to refute my opponent's story, where should I be refuting it? And this is where covering smart also comes in, right? This is what I should be covering. All of this comes into one thing, and you realize they're all moving parts of one strategy, right? Because all these tactics play into each other. And I guarantee, when I first learned this lesson, the first time I heard this speech was when I was a junior varsity debater in high school, my sophomore year of high school, 6 years ago now. And I had just gone into varsity for the first time, and I went 0-4. Okay, it was a humiliating feeling. Like, we just got destroyed by every varsity team. And every round we would get out, we'd be like, we should have won that round. That was unfair. The judge just sucked. They were just biased because we're younger. Okay, that was our attitude, because that's how you think when you're not a good debater. And this is true. Like, I'm not trying to say there are not bad judges and there are not unfair rounds. Oh my God, there are. But a good debater does not interpret losses that way, because you don't grow from that. You accept that some judges are just horrible, but you also think about the truth in every round and the lesson you can learn from every round. So to go back to this, we went 0-4. We went to our debate coach and we articulated ourselves exactly as I articulated myself before. It was all unfair. They were all like, just basically, they were just signing the ballot for them no matter what we said, blah, 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 blah. Coach looks at me and says, Javaria, you need to learn how to judge debates. I was like, what? I'm like, no, I want more drills. No, I want to do more practice. He said, no, Javaria, stop talking. You're going to go watch debates and judge them. Then you're going to bring me your ballot and I'm going to evaluate it. And I was like, he's insane. Like, what is he talking about? How would judging help me debate? I did it. And I was like, oh my God. I was judging varsity rounds. It's like, this is so hard. Like, it's so hard to decide which team to evaluate. Like, how do I make any of these decisions? I couldn't do it. And the reason was because at that moment, I had never learned how to win a round yet. I myself won rounds because I sounded better than my opponents. That's how I had sailed through novice, and that's how I'd sailed through junior varsity. But that doesn't fly in varsity, and that doesn't fly in national tournaments. And the thing is, writing those ballots taught me how to win rounds. The next tournament, I went 4-0. I took a break for one tournament and judged, and the next tournament I went 4-0. Why? Because I learned the most valuable lesson in that month. I just judged. I just thought about what a judge sees. And this is why I get to my final point. I think this is one of the best exercises that you can do after every practice round. I think that after every round, proposition should take 5 minutes to explain why opposition won the round, not why they lost the round. Notice how I framed it. This is not, oh, I just threw the round by accident because I forgot this one thing. No. What did your opponents do well? Not what did you do wrong? What you did wrong can be fixed in redo speeches or by your coach giving you feedback. No, why did my opponent win the round? Opposition should do the same thing with proposition. Why did my opponent win the round? What you will learn from this exercise, and especially doing it repeated many times, is how to decide who wins a round. And it's something that will later on become so intuitive to you that you can predict the nexus question. You can see where the clash is going to happen before it happens. You can see where the framework should be on any resolution because you do this so often and you see what it's like to judge. Thank you. Do we have any questions on this final part before I wrap up? Or on any parts before, because this is the wrap up. Any questions? Last, and also please, you can email me. I promise I'm not just saying it. I do check my email. I coach quite frequently. I would love to help you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens when you misspeak? Like you say your point wrong or your teammate or something, and then in the next speech, should the teammate fix it, or should they just say like, oh, I'm sorry, our first teammate misspoke, we meant this, or what should you do at that point?
Okay, so this is actually a very complicated question, so I'm going to answer it in 3 ways for 3 different kind of scenarios, okay? First is you just missay a word or two, but your claim gets messed up, let's say that, right? But your warrants are fine and your impacts are fine. In that case, you just get up in the next speech and say, hey, judge, our claim sounded weird. Here's what we meant. But you already knew that because the warrants already indicate that, and so do the impacts, right? That's the most common type of misspeaking. Like when you say your independent point, maybe you use the wrong word or you don't frame it how you meant to, but that's fine because of the 3 parts of an argument, the claim is actually the least important. Claims are only important because they clarify to a judge how they should look at something. That's why you have claims, right? But that's not the meat of your argument. So if you mess up the claim, just re-say it in your next speech and clarify. And a good judge will just be like, oh, that makes sense. Because your warrants seem to be saying that already, and so did your impact. In fact, they might even auto-correct in their head and not even notice that you misspoke. That happens to me sometimes. When teams misspeak, but I see their warrant and their impact, I don't even notice they misspoke because I'm just filling in the blanks in my head. But like, I'll write it incorrectly because I'm writing exactly what they said. But like when I look at it, I know what it means. That one I would say is the least important. The second one though is the more important one, which is when you misinterpret your own argument or your opponent's argument. This isn't actually misspeaking. This is a comprehension issue. Sometimes it might just be misspeaking. Like sometimes it might actually just be that you understood it on your page and you understood in your head, but you got nervous and bungled it and responded to the wrong thing. To be honest, it's very hard to recover from that if it's in a rebuttal speech. Like if it's in your last speech, it's probably over, right? There's not, unless you catch yourself like 10 seconds later, then you can just roll it back and say it again, right? But if it's at the end of your speech or late in a rebuttal speech, you probably just go with it and try to win on something else because there's not much you can do at that point. In a constructive, if that happens, if say you misunderstand an opponent's argument and you respond to something that wasn't actually said, but you catch it later on the flow. You catch it later on the page. Like you realize that you said it incorrectly. What you would say here is, hey judge, I'm sorry, can you actually revisit that point? Like the second independent point my opponent made, I misspoke. What I meant to say is this. Yes, it might lose you points for structure, right? It might look less cool, but at that point, it's better to just suck it up and say the correct point because it might still win you the round. Even if it hurts your individual speaker points, it won't hurt your team, right? If it's a really important point, make sure you say it. The last is when your opponent misinterprets your point. And this is tricky because this is when opponents pigeonhole you. How do you respond? There will be times when an opponent will be very ungenerous with how they interpret your argument. They'll interpret the worst version of it. At that moment, what you say is you literally say that. Like you look at the judge and you say, all of what they said may be true. There is some probability of this happening if our argument goes through, say that, right? But that's the worst version of our argument and the least likely scenario. But in the best version of our argument, with the most likely, and which we will say is the most likely scenario, like win on probability, that doesn't happen, right? You should always point out when your opponents are doing that to you, when they're misinterpreting your arguments or misspeaking about your arguments. Like you should jump on it. If your opponent misspeaks, and it's clear that this misspeaking comes from a misinterpretation especially, jump on it. But if your opponent misspeaks a claim and it's only just a misspeaking a claim, don't waste your time 5 minutes on that misspoken claim because the judge will look at the warrant and the impact and still understand what they're talking about. Does that make sense? Yes? I'm gonna say yes.
Yes, yeah, to me it did. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Sorry, I got disconnected from the.
Oh no, you're totally good. Thanks. Any other questions?
Sister Javaria, I know you had mentioned at the beginning that you'd like questions about the argument, but we have a couple about style. Is that
Sure.
okay to talk about?
Sure. I mean, I don't mind doing it now that it's done. I just didn't want to have those in the middle of the presentation because they, mess up my mind. Yes,
Exactly.
please.
Thank you. Okay, so the first one, let's see. Nabil Chaudhry is asking, what are some tips for improving your speech time? I'm guessing he means to fill up your 5-minute or 3-minute slot or whatever. If that's not right, Nabil, please speak up.
No, that's what I meant.
And Nabil, I love your profile picture. Okay, so let's see. Speaking to time. I think that this is something that is difficult when you're starting debate, mostly because what you're actually struggling with is argument generation. I'm imagining that's what this question is actually about. Am I correct?
Kind of, yeah.
Like, I imagine this is mostly for constructive speeches, correct? Not rebuttals?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this is argument generation. I think that the best way to generate arguments when you're a new debater is to do 3 things. So I'm going to go through all 3 of them. And I'm also going to stop sharing just because I don't need to share anymore. I think that the first thing that you need to do is look at the resolution and think if there are any words in the resolution that need to be defined or counter-defined. The framework, right? That's a really easy way to generate an overview. Usually you don't want your framework to be an independent point because framework alone is not a reason why you win the round. But it is important. It's establishing the rules of the debate. So it's usually like a, small paragraph that you're going to put at the top, or it's what we call an overview. That's the first way to start. If you can't think of anything, start with that. Because from that, you're more likely than not able to generate more arguments. So let's start with framework. The next thing is, I'm sure most people have told you, but you typically need to have 3 independent points. But let's say you're struggling and you can only have 2. And that happens to the best of us. Oh my God, the round that I was debating short selling disclosure, we actually won that round, spoiler alert, but we only had 2 independent points. That was a very difficult round for us to oppose. But what we did was, because we couldn't think of a lot of claims, we just added warrants and impacts to the 2 claims that we had. So instead of having 2 small points, we had 2 incredibly strong points with multiple warrants, such that even if they refuted 1 warrant, we didn't need that warrant to win. We had 5 other ones, right? Even if they took out 1 impact, we had 2 others. This may sound weird, but oftentimes if you can have 1 argument, it's easier to come up with things that support that argument than to come up with another argument, right? So in that instance, I would say do that. If you absolutely can't come up with anything, bolster the points you have. The last thing is practice. Here's how you practice doing it. You should look up college debates and their resolutions, and you should practice. Okay, so I'm going to just give you a cheat sheet. This is American Parliamentary Debate Association.web, apta.web or apta.org, okay? That's the organization that I was a part of. That's the Collegiate American Parliamentary Debate Association. They have thousands of rounds completely recorded. It's a very slow debate. In fact, it's actually parliamentary debate. It's what your form of debate is based off. This is what I do. It's called an LOC drill. What you do is you hear the Prime Minister's speech and you hear the resolution and you practice responding to that before the actual leader of the opposition gives their speech. Then you play the leader of opposition's speech and you see how your speech compares to their speech. Doing that for many different topic areas will make you very good argument generation, not only because you're watching experienced debaters give arguments, but because you are practicing arguments. Sadly, beyond practice, there's not really a trick after the 2 things I told you before to generate arguments and fill up speech time in constructives.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
So another question on, let's see, let me try to find it here. Okay. Hiba Mehreen asks, are there any tips on how to better transition between points when speaking?
Yeah, quite a few. So in college parliamentary debate, and this is what I obviously am speaking my references to, we usually say, my first independent point is, my first subpoint under that, my second subpoint under that, my third subpoint under that. Then we say, my second independent point is, and so forth. When refuting, we say, my opponent's first independent point is this. We have 2 responses. Response A is this. Response B is this. That makes it very clear. It sounds good. And the reason why you do it that way is because you are cognizant of how the judge is writing. If you label your points, your judge will write down that label, and then later they can evaluate things much more clearly, especially for rebuttals. If you were like, oh, concede my second independent point, we're not going to talk about that, and your judge has no idea which of your points is your second independent point, you're in a really bad spot. So that's called signposting, being very clear of where you are. That's the pure argument part of that. The second part of this is the rhetoric part, which I imagine you might also be asking about, like how do you make it sound pretty? What I tend to do is, I tend to, especially when I'm giving rebuttals, do something called a 2 worlds analysis. And this is it's a lot more difficult, but this is something that you get to do when you're a good debater and once you've debated for many years. But I can tell you the strategy too behind it if you want to try doing it when you're giving your shorter speeches that need to sound good. Because constructives, honestly, for constructives, as long as you're getting information out there and it's coherent and you're doing what I just said, signposting, you're probably fine. Because you have more time in your speech to do rhetorical flourish, right? You can use rhetoric, you can use examples. Those are the things that make your speech sound good. Rebuttals, you do not have time for that. If you are wasting time on rhetoric or rhetorical flourishes, you're going to lose the round, right? So what you should do instead is organize your rebuttal very nicely. What I like to do is I like to divide my flow or divide my sheet of paper down the middle and write my world, my opponent's world. In my world, I list all the claims that I have listed and I suppose that they are true. I write the best version of all of my arguments and how they would play out. I then write the worst version of the arguments. And usually you're probably picking one argument. So you're just doing the best version of that one argument, the worst version of that one argument, and I explain them. Then I write my opponent's world. I don't say this. I just say, this is what you call the even if statement. You then look at what is the best response my opponent has to my argument? What is the worst response they have? Why do I beat both of them? Why does my best world beat those arguments? And why does my worst world even beat those arguments? That's called a two worlds analysis in college debate. That sounds very good, is very persuasive, and makes your judge's ballot very clear. Because if you do that and your opponent doesn't, your speech sounds like it has clash and it sounds comparative. On a pure just logos level, a logical level, you sound better, right? Does that make sense? That's what we call crystallization in college when you do that.
So how, like, when you're writing it,
Yeah.
how do you approach writing it? Like, how much do you write, like, to each point? Like, just in general, like, what are the practices that you follow while going with that two-world approach while you're preparing your rebuttals?
So I will say, I'm in other debate circuits, we have something called flowing, which is a style of note-taking in speeches that is very efficient. And I use shorthand, right? So because I did policy debate, can store up to 5 minutes in my mind behind where I'm writing. So I usually can get everything that is said in the round, right? Because policy debate is about 5 times faster than any other form of debate. And I had to do that at a national level. So I think that for me, it's a little bit different. But I think that in general, what I teach my novice debaters is that you should always write the claim of every independent point and that your opponent says and that you say, right? And you should at least have one warrant and one impact for everything that was said, if they were given. Like sometimes your opponents might not give a warrant or might not give an impact, right? And sometimes your opponent might give multiple warrants, but you didn't understand the entire warrant, you got a part of it, write whatever you can. So that's the first part. Because once you write that, you can do anything that I'm saying. Like it's really easy because you already have it written down. You can just draw an arrow to what you're gonna say and be like, here's what I'm doing. Typically, I dedicate a completely new sheet to my rebuttal. I do not write down rebuttals on the same page as constructives. First of all, it's because I'm a rebuttal speaker, so I'm actually speaking the rebuttal, right? So I need more space. But also, when I'm doing rebuttals, like I am doing a diagram and I'm drawing things, right? I need all the space on the page. I think it's a good like rule of thumb to give yourself a whole new, completely blank page if you are the rebuttal speaker. If you are the constructive speaker and your partner is giving a rebuttal, before your partner's rebuttal, I suggest telling your partner anything that you said in your speech that you think needs to be in the rebuttal. Communication, right? Be like, hey partner, what are you gonna choose? Like this is where you have that conversation with your team. What are you choosing? If they wanna choose something that's different than what you thought, give your input, but understand that ultimately they're the rebuttal speaker. They're the one who has to get up there and defend it. So maybe you have a difference of opinion, support them. So maybe you don't agree with it, doesn't matter. Think of different ways that rebuttal can win the round and write it down on a piece of paper for them if they need it, right? That's the best way, I think. I think a lot of it is also teamwork. Like, even though only one person is giving the rebuttal, debate is a team effort. Both people should be involved in the rebuttal, even though one has the ultimate say.
Sister Javaria, I'm going to encourage people to watch this again because you covered a lot of ground. One thing, if you could help us with, we in our organization here, we do the structure, the debate, the proposition side according to the ARE method, which is assertion, reasoning, and evidence. And then we have, the resolution and that we're arguing. When you talk about a warrant, how is that relating to, for our students here, relating more to the reasoning portion of the ARE, right?
Yes.
Okay.
It's the reason. Yeah, it's the reason.
So there's different ways of saying the same thing.
Yes.
When she's talking about warrant, she means the reasoning. So
yeah,
when you
I
listen-
apologize. I am coming from a background that is quite different, obviously, from this.
No, please don't apologize. These are very, 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 very important things you've shared with us. And it's important to hear it the way you know it, and then we can adopt it that way. Inshallah. Are there any more questions, folks?
Are there any people who have questions on just pure, like, how to speak, or anyone who has nerves, or anything that's like soft skills oriented? Because I can definitely help with that too. Don't be afraid. I will tell you this. I think up until 2 years ago, I threw up before every single out round. So anytime I was out in quarterfinals, semifinals, or finals at any tournament, I would throw up, and I would not eat before that. It was really bad. Because I got, even though I didn't debate for 6-7 years, I got so nervous. Like, I remember when we were going up against Yale in that semifinal round, this was the team that was the national champions on finance, who intentionally read a finance case because they knew that that was my weakness, right? That was the one thing I hadn't studied. Yes, I subscribed to The Economist to try and learn it, but like, it's hard to teach yourself finance, right? I was so nervous. But, I learned coping methods. There are ways to, even though you're nervous, not make it show in rounds. So if you ever have questions, or if you don't feel comfortable saying it, which I totally understand, email me. Please do take advantage of me as a resource. I really won't judge you. It happens to everyone. All good debaters will tell you there are moments when they feel pit in their stomach. And there's also moments when you mess up speeches. Don't let that discourage you.
So I have one question that plagues me, something that plagues me a lot. Do you have any tips on how you try to be more concise in your speeches, and especially in your rebuttals? Because like that's where I struggle the most, really. Like, I'll start going off on a tangent essentially on a rebuttal, and then I'll like forget to go on the offense, really. Because any tips regarding?
So I think you answered your question a little bit by saying it. You forget your offense. Put your offense first. That way, even if you go off on a tangent, you always have something, right? So we'll go back to the offense. Put your offense first. That's one way to keep yourself on task. But I think the other way is to do redos. This means you should keep the notes that you took in a speech in a round, especially if you take good notes. And later on when you're at home, set a timer and redo that rebuttal. Rebuttal redos are something that at the national circuit in high school, I think before, I went to Capital Debate Tournament for my Tournament of the Champions bid in high school. I think it was my junior year. I did 70 redos in a month. It was a lot. I mean, that was an extreme level, right? Because we were competing at the highest level. But I think on average, a good rule of thumb is if you had more losses than wins, you should at least be doing 2 rebuttals of your losses there. At least 2. I think that's a really good rule of thumb, because oftentimes you don't lose rounds based on constructives or based on rebuttals. And also, even if you did lose a round based on a constructive, like your constructive was so bad, it happens, but there's always something that a rebuttal speaker can do to come back from that. Like I am a rebuttal speaker, right? I've had teammates who gave horrible constructives so many times and we've still won the round because I worked with what I had. So redos are very helpful. I think that's the only real trick. I also think that narrating and judging the debate, if you want to rewatch that segment that's recorded, is really helpful, because that will also teach you the styles of how the judge sees the round and perhaps how you should give a rebuttal in front of a certain judge. I know this sounds bad, but this is a very advanced technique, but I don't give rebuttals the same way in front of every judge. I know my judges, especially when you compete at higher levels, you get to know a judge. Every person has a bias. Like, it's just not true that anyone doesn't. If you learn that a judge has a certain proclivity for how they evaluate things, or sorry, proclivity, my bad, tendency to prioritize certain things, play into that in your rebuttal. Like, it doesn't hurt you, right? Like, maybe it's not your favorite thing, but once you become more advanced, you just do it because it wins you rounds. Maybe it sounds uncomfortable. Maybe you're not a fan. Just do it.
I have a question about
Yes.
what is called again, the right of the proposition to define the topic. Like, for example, like after you've researched a topic and you turn out as opposition, the proposition defines the topic as something slightly different, right? They've defined the scope of the topic as something that is like what's called slightly more limited than what you have done. Like, I've like for example, my team has been through that, and through this, like, for example, 3 of our points, they were completely gone. They were out of the scope of the debate now. So, like, you have any ways that we can like overcome this or use this to our advantage?
Let me just say that because we're at 3:51, that'll be our last question, inshallah.
Yeah.
And after Sister Javaria's answer, we'll wrap up, inshallah.
Sounds good. So I have judged some MYDT debates, so I know what you're talking about. This is definitely a thing where the structure that I am accustomed to, which is actually parliamentary structure, is very different from a little bit from what MYDT does. Because so while there is a right of proposition, or what we call like the government team in parliamentary debate, the opposition team can show that a certain model or a certain interpretation of the resolution is unfair or just not debatable, right? That's something that happens in collegiate debate. From your structure, I think you can still have a counter definition. Like, I would not say just accept their framework or their definition and then just give up the round. Because thinking of 3 completely new points in a short time while I do it, I think it's difficult, especially when you're learning, right? In that round, I would say framework becomes really important. Maybe you should spend a little bit more time than you usually were or usually do explaining why their framework is an incorrect interpretation or a less generous interpretation. If you can't do that, or somehow the round doesn't permit, or if a certain judge doesn't like that, I personally don't care. Like, I think you should do that, but if you can't, I think what you should do then is look at their points. Look at the points that they said and just refute them directly. Because you're opposition, right? You don't have the burden to affirm. You just have the burden to negate. So if you just directly refute the 3 points they came up with, you can still win. Like, if you can prove that nothing is better than there's something, that's still winning when you're opposition, right? Because you don't have a burden to have offense in the same way that, like, you don't have a burden to affirm. You have a burden to have offense because that is your offense. That refutation is your offense. Does that make sense? So, like, say the 3 points that you came up with as opposition are not in the scope of the debate, and you can't think of 3 new points, don't waste your time. You're not going to be able to. Just write what they're saying and think about a logical response to each of those things. And then hopefully your rebuttal speaker can frame it even more offensively for you.
All right, that makes sense.
Can I say something? Can I say something? Javaria? Can I say something?
Yes, so yes, he says, sorry, I wasn't sure who you were asking. I think you cut out for a second.
I just wanted to say that I want to make sure that the debaters understand correctly that ideally you should take the definition, right? Ideally you should try, unless it actually is unfair or completely lopsided or undebatable. Ideally, no matter what they say, let's say I prepared 3 points and they define it in a way that all 3 points are obsolete, but it is a nice and debatable definition. Ideally, I should take it. It shouldn't be that, oh, since my point.
I'm sorry, I understand what you all are talking about, and we have different words for this. So you're not actually asking about framework, you're asking about the model, aren't you? you're talking about modeling power, but you keep saying like definitions and framework. But what you actually mean is if the proposition has a model, like they
So,
say that
if I could just clarify, so basically there's going to be a topic, right? Like cats are better than dogs.
Yeah.
And then the proposition team will come up and define, they have the right to define that topic. So cats, Siamese cats are better than, some other dog because they're more independent. And then that's around that definition is what the debate is going to revolve, not around the broader topic.
Oh, okay, sorry, that's not, so in college debate, that's not called a definition, that's called a model. So if the whole resolution is about cats and dogs and you pick a specific cat, yes, opposition cannot refute which cat, right? That's not allowed, you have to debate that. But you can refute what it means to be better than in that instance, right? Like you can refute other parts of that's framework. I didn't realize the disconnect until right now when sister, I think it was Faiza, was saying something. Yes, you cannot refute the model because that they do have modeling power. We call that a model in college parliamentary debate, but you can refute other things like metrics, like that's framework. So what I was saying was shift the framework, right? If they say it's about Siamese cats being better pets, you can change the metric for what it means to be a better pet. That's allowed. That's just shifting the framework. That's not changing the model.
So what falls under model and what falls under framework, really?
Well,
so is metric just does metric always fall? Are you not allowed to define the metric in a model?
I don't know. So I don't know what you do in your style debate, but in college debate, at least in college British parliamentary debate, the affirmative has a burden to give a model, and if they don't, then opposition is allowed to model. But I don't think that's how MYDT.
Yeah, that is. If the proposition neglects to define the topic, then the opposition can define it for them.
So yes, you can model. So like say that the proposition gets up and just goes with cats are better than dogs, but says nothing else. It doesn't really explain it and just has points about why cats are good, right? Then yeah, opposition could get up and talk about something more specific, like a specific facet, because they neglected to. But the idea is that the proposition has the right to model. It's called the right to propose. Does that make sense? Does that clarify? I think I didn't think about that. I apologize for that. That was my misinterpretation of some words.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to.
No, modeling power, which in other forms of debate they call fiat power, you cannot change that. But you can change the way you evaluate that model. That's what you should do. If the government has a certain way of evaluating it and you have a different way, that's fine. That's usually just weighing. That's framework. That's clash. That's other things.
So when you listen to this again, remember modeling is defining the topic, right? Basically, when you talk about modeling.
Yes, modeling is, I would say it's narrowing the topic. Because you can't exceed the topic. That's what modeling is. Defining is a little bit different. Defining is just, you can define metrics, you can define an interpretation. There's so many definitions that happen in debate rounds. What we mean is when a team narrows the topic to something, you cannot exceed the bounds of that. Otherwise, it really is irrelevant.
And that's what over here in MAFIC and MYDT, when we tell them to define the topic, we really mean narrowing it.
Okay.
So that's basically what that is.
Okay, that's good to know from my own edification. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Javaria. Thank you so much for your generosity of time, wisdom, experience, knowledge, your generosity of spirit. You know, as I was listening to you, I was just thinking about our young people. I'm of a different generation. I'm also a UVA grad, but graduated before you were born.
Wahoo!
Wahoo! So thanks for representing UVA. But alhamdulillah, you know, we have people out there like AOC that we might admire, but we have you, alhamdulillah, who looks like us, who has a name like ours, who believes in the things we believe in. And you can't really have a better role model than someone like you for our demographic here, our youth. So Jazakallah khair, thank you so much. I also, you know, just reflecting on what you said in your last point about really thinking about why the other side won. It feels like that's important in life generally. You know, it's about intellectual humility, and our dean teaches us, our prophet teaches us to be humble. And then the example you gave about how you guys beat that David and Goliath, you beat the Yale team, it was because you had the intellectual humility. And they didn't, they were arrogant, and they were just beating and beating and beating, but you guys turned it around and were smart about it. You had the intellectual humility, and you were really able to overcome, you know, such a prominent team. And I think that's an allegory for life. So thank you so much. And, you know, we look forward to following you in the future, inshallah. And best of luck at Oxford. And, are you going to be going there, or is it online?
Yes. So my program only has 6 people. So, and you work one-on-one with your professor, who's your advisor. So we are doing still in-person everything. So inshallah, I have to matriculate because Oxford requires a matriculation ceremony, but I'm leaving late September, inshallah. And then I'll be there for 2 years. I'll probably come back just in the summers between the start of the next year.
May Allah grant you tawfiq in all your endeavors, and inshallah we look forward to learning more from you when you get back, and Eid Mubarak to everybody.
One thing I just wanted to say to just my women, there's just a quick thing I just wanted to say.
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like your voice isn't heard. It feels like no matter what you say, the judge ignores it. There's just times when debate is really hard. I think especially as a woman, it's just true, right? But I think what you have to remember is that losing rounds does not determine how good of a debater you are. There will be unfair losses, and that's just part of it. And as long as you take a lesson from it, it's still a win. Because at the end of the day, people cannot underwrite you forever. This happened to me a lot. I am the only visibly in Muslim, and what I mean by that is I wear the hijab, right? There are the Muslim people, but I think it's triply hard if you present as Muslim more, especially if you are brown and you wear a scarf, right? It happens. It happens so much my novice year in college. But I took the best parts of the decisions I got, and it was okay. In the long run, your skills will speak for themselves, inshallah. So don't be discouraged.
And I think we can again apply that to life as well. So alhamdulillah, a lot of life debates and a lot of life lessons in debate. Jazakallah khair. I'll give it to Brother Mustafiz, inshallah, to wrap up.
So I think you should wrap up, Brother Hassan. Jazakallah khair. I think this is very interesting, very beneficial. May Allah reward you all.
So I want to please keep us in your du'as in these blessed last few days, these blessed 10 days, first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. We have Yawm al-Arafah coming up on Thursday, inshallah. So everyone keep each other in your du'as, keep Mafik Foundation in your du'as, and keep, let's make dua for everyone to be safe from the virus. And Eid Mubarak early and to everyone. And inshallah, I'll wrap up with Surat Al-Asr. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal Asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilu s-salihat wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Sadaqallah al-azim. Jazakallah khair, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Bye.